I'm so glad you've joined us today here at Bible Backdrop. Today we are going into the trial of Jesus. If you'd like to read along with us, it is Matthew 26, verses 57 through chapter 27, verse 26, Mark 14, verse 53 to chapter 15, verse 15, Luke 22, verse 66 to chapter 23, verse 25, and John 18, verse 12 to John 19, verse 15. There's a lot of verses to cover here, so we'll just kind of give you a synopsis as we combine these Gospels. But if you remember where we left off in our last video, Jesus was being pulled away in chains. Not really pulled, he went willingly with the high priest and the Roman army. It is dusk. And so technically, by Jewish law, within the chief priests and within that sector, there was to be no trials or anything done during the night. And here we see this broken right away. Jesus is first taken to Annas' house. Now, Annas, if we remember who he is Caiaphas, who is the chief priest. He is his father. Now, in the Jewish priesthood tradition, you were a chief priest for life. But here we see actually in history that Annas has stepped down and has given the chief priest role to his son Caiaphas. But we believe that because they took him to Annas' house first, that he still had the reputation of the chief priest. Now, if we remember why Annas stepped down that we had talked about previously, is his other sons were making a lot of money off of the temple concessions, which Jesus was not a fan of when he overthrew those tables. And so Annas and Caiaphas hate Jesus because he is going after their main money stream, which is the temple marketplace, and pulling money from those Jews for those sacrifices. So Jesus shows up at Annas' house, and the first thing Annas asks him is, "What is your doctrine?" Now, we need to understand in the scriptures why this was wrong, because just like today we kind of have that Fifth Amendment, they had that too, where they weren't allowed to ask certain questions in order to protect a just trial. And Jesus says this to him. He says, "Why are you asking me this question? Ask those who heard me." In other words, Jesus is saying, get witnesses right off the bat. Here we see this first little trial system. He is saying, hey, this is illegal. You're not supposed to be asking me these questions. This is not a just trial. And we see the illegality of this trial right from the beginning. Second, and very shortly after Annas can't get answers from Jesus, they take him to Caiaphas' house, the actual chief priest, and this is where the trial happens. Here we see the Sanhedrin. It's a 71-person Jewish Supreme Court show up at nighttime at Caiaphas' house. Again, understanding that this is completely illegal. And if we remember Caiaphas, if you remember a line that he had said previously, he said, it's better for one man to die for the people. In other words, they had it out for Jesus from the very beginning. They wanted him to physically die for the people. Why? Because he was causing this uproar within the Jewish sect. And also, it was because he was going after them and their own belief systems. He was becoming more popular than them. And here, Caiaphas is saying we should be willing to let him die for the people so that we can keep on going the way that we were going. And although that is exactly what happened, Jesus did die for all of these people. But Caiaphas was speaking out of a place of murder. So here, when we're at Caiaphas' house, they spent the night actually holding the trial that ended at daylight. You're going to see in the scriptures that they were continually trying to find people to come forward and testify and saying, what did this man do? We needed to testify of what his sins were, but nobody could come forward. When you actually see it, you see that there was all this contradicting, or maybe people were coming forward just for that moment of fame, like, I'll tell you what he did, but it didn't really happen. It didn't really make sense. There wasn't those that would vouch for that. But then one man came forward and said, he said he was able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. And the temple was a very, very sanctified place for them. And so for them to go, what? He said he could destroy the temple? And at this point, we know that Jesus was actually talking about his human body, that he would destroy the temple of God, that Jesus himself, and he would rebuild it in 3 days as he would be resurrected 3 days later. But they took it in a very literal form. And it actually says that Caiaphas says, he yells at him, tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. But Jesus said, you have said it yourself. You see, Jesus didn't come forward and say, yes, I am the Son of God, because he knew that's exactly what they wanted him to do. And by saying that, he knew that that was going to put him straight on that cross. It would be his own undoing if he spoke it to them. But Caiaphas, being that he alluded to it, saying, you said it yourself. You said I was the Son of God. That Caiaphas tore his robes and he yells, he has blasphemed. What further do we have of any witnesses? Behold, you now have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They answered, he deserves death. You see, when Caiaphas says that he tears his robes, it was a representation of great grief, saying this man claims that he is the Son of God, and he is so torn up about it that he actually tears his robes. And as this crowd starts yelling of the Jewish Sanhedrin court, saying that he deserves death, they covered up his head, and they started punching Jesus, saying, who punched you? Tell us who punched you. But can I tell you that you and I both know that Jesus knew exactly the name of that person who punched him each time. But he didn't say it. He simply remained quiet. They took off that head thing and they spit in his eyes, and they were ready to kill him. But here's the thing. The Jewish Sanhedrin Supreme Court had no power to kill Jesus. In fact, if they did, they probably would have done a Jewish death, which wasn't crucifixion, it was a stoning. And so if they had the power, they probably would have taken him out back right then and started stoning him before the whole city awoke, as it was full of people that were there to celebrate the Passover and definitely fans of Jesus, as we saw in the triumphal entry. But instead, they had no power. In 30 AD, Rome took over the Israel government, and they took away all capital punishment abilities away from the Jewish Supreme Court. The only person that could make these decisions was the Roman officials that Rome had put in place. So this high council, this religious body, truly had no power, and they could only settle minor civil disputes. But a Roman death would mean crucifixion, where a Jewish death just 2 years earlier would have meant a stoning. And so here the Roman officials have no choice but to take Jesus to Pilate. It says, very early in the morning, the leading priests and the elders of the people met again to lay plans for putting Jesus to death. That's in Matthew 27:1. Hear the empowerment in that scripture. They feel like we can take him to Pilate. We maybe have some control over Pilate, and we can get Pilate to crucify Jesus. You see, Pilate was the Roman governor of Judea. He was over that area, and he would be the one that could make that decisions. But historical records actually tell us that Pilate was not popular with the Jewish people. And every person in this area are Jewish people that he is over. You see, he had taken money from the temple to build an aqueduct, thinking that it would make the people happy. But because they took their money from their temple that meant something to them, they hated him. It was a prime for rebellion. In fact, there were other things he had done that had caused these uproars and these riots. And Rome had already said, hey, you're kind of losing control of Judea. What's going on? And so here he's got some major strikes against him, and even Pilate himself is a little bit nervous if he can control this area. But see, the religious leaders are smart. They know that although they're wanting to crucify him for the blasphemy, that they have to spin it a little bit when they come to Pilate. They have to make it sound more political, that he's not wanting to be necessarily the Messiah, but he's being king of the Jews. Because if they can say that he's trying to be king of the Jews, then maybe Rome would think it as a political rebellion. And so it has to be spun that way for Rome in order to put the capital punishment in place. So here we have Pilate who sees Jesus, and the Roman officials counteract and say, we wouldn't have brought him to you if he wasn't a criminal. The chief priest saying, we wouldn't have brought him to you if he wasn't a criminal. But Pilate, seeing that there's really nothing wrong, like he says he's the Messiah, but this has nothing to do with Rome. If he says he's a Messiah, I can't punish him. I can't kill him for that. So Pilate says, then judge him by your own law, which couldn't mean they couldn't kill him. It had to be some other kind of civil punishment. But we don't have the power to execute someone, the chief priests say. And they began to state their case. This man has been leading our people astray by telling them not to pay their taxes to Roman government, and by claiming he is the Messiah, a king. You see, they're pulling out things from Jesus going, he says that don't pay your taxes to Caesar, which actually, when you look up in the scriptures, how about Matthew 22:21, where Jesus says, pay to Caesar's what is Caesar's? You see, Jesus never said don't pay your taxes to Caesar, but the religious officials are putting these words in Pilate's head, trying to spin it so that he will crucify Jesus. But he did say he was the Messiah, and they're spinning it as if he's saying he was a king. Pontius Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus says, you have said it again. You see, when all the accusations come slinging Jesus' way, again, throughout this whole trial, you're going to see that he either says something simple as you have said it, or he doesn't say anything at all. I need you to understand that Isaiah 53:7, something that these religious officials, these chief priests would have read as they had the book of Isaiah in their hands. It says, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shears, he is silent, and so he does not open his mouth. Hebrews, another book that these chief priests would have read and had, says, he will choose not to defend himself. Live as he lives to defend you. Hebrews 7:25. You see, Jesus, by saying nothing, was actually fulfilling prophecy. In fact, Isaiah 53:7, we see that even currently that is kept out of the synagogue in Jewish customs even today, because it describes Jesus too thoroughly on exactly what he did. Pilate is in a hard place because he doesn't know what to do. Technically, this man isn't worthy of crucifixion, yet these people are wanting it so bad. And he hears through the conversation that Jesus was from Galilee. And he says, well, wait a minute. Herod's in town. Herod is in town for the Passover, and technically, he's over Galilee. So let's send him to Herod Antipas. And so they send them over to him. Now, we need to know that Pilate and Herod were actually enemies. Why? A couple reasons. First, Pilate took over Herod's brother. Herod's brother used to run the area of Judea. It was his half-brother, but he was really poor at what he did. He didn't do it well, and so Rome came in and kicked Herod's brother out and put Pilate in the place. And so obviously Herod is a little bit upset, like that was my brother's territory and now you have taken over. But also only a little bit earlier, we actually see that Pilate ordered some killings of some Galileans who were in Jerusalem at the temple for something they had done. And here Herod doesn't like that either. Now you're killing handfuls of my people that came into your land. Obviously they probably did something to deserve it in Pilate's eyes, but we can understand this rift between these two men. They did not like each other. And Herod, we have to understand the history of Herod. Herod was actually the one that imprisoned John the Baptist. Do you remember this story? You see, John the Baptist came and he was talking all about Jesus. He was talking about the Messiah coming. And Herod, had this illegal marriage to this woman. And John the Baptist was coming forward telling Herod that it was wrong. And then we actually find it interesting when we read the scriptures. It says, Herod was greatly disturbed when he talked to John, but even so, he liked to listen to him. And I think that we can pick up from this that probably John the Baptist was one of the few people that was honest and true to Herod. He told him what it really was and not like just putting those sweet stuff in his ear. And he appreciated that. But you see, John the Baptist was speaking out about the illegal wife of Herod. And so when Herod gives her a gift and she says, I want John the Baptist's head on a plate as a gift, it actually, the scriptures tell us that Herod felt greatly, greatly disturbed with the killing of John the Baptist. And so we actually see here in the scriptures that Herod is excited to see Jesus. Why? Because of this relationship he had with John the Baptist. And he actually asked Jesus, show me a miracle. Show me a miracle. But see, Jesus knew that if I did a miracle right now, it's not going to make Herod change his mind or do anything different. And Jesus refused, which made Herod mad. You see, the Jewish leaders were claiming that Jesus was too heavenly, trying to describe him as the Messiah, as the Son of God. And that was his claim that they wanted to take him down. But see, Herod actually sees him too earthly. You won't do the things that Jesus is supposed to do. You're not doing miracles for me. You're not doing these things that you're supposed to be. So you're not him. I can't crucify you or put you to death because you're not being godly enough. You see, although we see that Herod and Pilate were at odds, the scriptures actually tell us in Luke 23:12, Herod and Pilate would have been enemies, but on this day, they became friends. Why? Because with both of them having equal authority in the areas they are within, they both found Jesus not guilty. Neither one of them could find Jesus willing to be crucified. And so here Herod sends Jesus back to Pilate. And now Pilate is in another predicament because now he's got Jesus here. He's got the chief priests and they're wanting Jesus to be dead. And so Pilate comes up with a plan and he says, wait a minute. Okay, so every year at Passover, I release one prisoner. And here it was Jewish tradition that he do this. And under pressure, he was like, you know what? What about Barabbas? Like, I'll release Barabbas or Jesus? Like, you tell me which one. Well, Barabbas was actually in prison for rebellion against Rome, and he had murdered someone in the process. And so in probably Pilate's mind, he thought, surely if both of these men are here because of the government trying to pretend like take over the Roman government as they're trying to portray Jesus to be, and as Barabbas actually was, surely they'll want Jesus to be free because Barabbas was actually a murderer and Jesus hadn't hurt anyone. But actually that backfires. It's interesting to me because Barabbas was guilty of the crime that Jesus was accused for. Barabbas had taken a life, and here Jesus is getting ready to give his life as we see the parables between these two men. So although he may have offered Barabbas as thinking surely they'll just release Jesus because they're not going to want this man out in the street, we have to understand that perhaps Barabbas could have been a little bit famous as he stood up to the Roman government, as these Jewish people are so upset over Rome taking such power and so much of their power away from them. But here, even Pilate had to adjust under Roman law, and Roman law says you cannot kill an innocent person. An innocent man should never be put to death. And yet Pilate is afraid of the crowd. And here the crowd is yelling to release Barabbas over Jesus. We see Pilate's wife come to Pilate through this time, and she says this. Her name was Claudia Procula, and she was the daughter of Augustus. And she says, leave that innocent man alone, meaning Jesus. I suffered through a terrible nightmare about him last night. Multiple people coming to him, don't do this, Pilate, don't do this. And actually history tells us that this woman, Claudia Procula, that she converted to Judaism, and that shortly after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, she became a Christ follower and spent many times telling people about Jesus, the risen Savior. But as the crowd is yelling for the release of Barabbas, Pilate says, well, what should I do with Jesus? You feel the turmoil in his voice in that. What should I do with him? I can't kill him. He's an innocent man, or what you say he's done is not worthy of death. But the chief priests were yelling at him. And it says in the scriptures, Matthew, it says, and they persuaded the multitude. You see, our crowd that was yelling Hosanna at the triumphal entry is easily persuaded. And I think we almost have to take a heart check on that and go, how easily are we persuaded by those that are around us? That as they whispered in the crowd, as the 71 Jewish Sanhedrin Supreme Court went around and said, let's separate in the crowd. And let's get going yelling, crucify him, crucifying. And the crowd will join us. And all of a sudden you have thousands of people yelling, crucify him. But Pilate says, why? What crime has he committed? But the crowd keeps yelling, crucify him. Why? Because there is no true explanation. But Pilate saw a riot forming. Perhaps this could be the last straw. Perhaps this could be what removes Pilate from power if another riot happens with all the other strikes against him and Rome watching him so closely. That he orders a scourging of Jesus, thinking maybe that will make him happy. They make this whole crowd happy. You see, a scourging, they would gather something called a flagellum. It was a whip. Some say it had 12 tails. Other calls it a cat of 9 tails and had 9 tails. But it was 9 leather pieces of strap with a ball on the end that had pieces of glass and stone poking out of it, but then pieces of glass and stone tied amongst the leather. They would pull him up by his arms with his feet inches from the ground. And they would take this cat of nine tails or this flagellum, whichever one it was, and they would smack it with him. And these lashes would hit the back of Jesus. Through this, we need to understand that it would create lines in his back as they would hit. And it would actually make your back muscles look more like hamburger meat as these stripes would start to form. Every time it hit, it would fall into those same grooves, ripping the muscle. And I want you to understand that Isaiah 53:5 says, by his stripes we are healed. The stripes that this verse is talking about are the stripes in this beating, as it would create stripes on his back as he took these first lashes here. You see, Pilate, after this lash happened, his back would be so torn up, and he threw a purple robe on him and pushed a crown of thorns on his head, and he said, look, here is your man. You see, he was trying to tell him, you guys, he's just a man. He's not God. I mean, look what he just went through. He was God. We would not have been able to put him through that. Look, he's just a man. He's trying to suffice the crowd because he does not want to kill Jesus. And he was ready to release him. But the crowd started yelling again, crucify him. But the Jewish leaders shouted to Pilate, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who declares himself a king is a rebel against Caesar. Basically, they are saying, if you don't do this, we will create such havoc in your land that you will be removed from power. And we're trying to help your cause. We're telling you that he's saying that he's king. So can't you just take this and do what we want? And we'll bring peace. We'll let you stay in power. We actually find that Pilate will call for a bowl of water to wash his hands. And I want you to understand that this is a Jewish custom. This wasn't a Roman custom. This was a Jewish custom. And basically what it would mean is if a man was murdered outside of the city gates and you didn't know who did it, it was a way of washing your hands of the matter, of you being innocent of the matter, and basically saying, don't ask for permission. I don't want to know. Pilate never says, crucify him. Pilate washes his hands and walks away. And these Jewish leaders know exactly what that means. The Roman guards know exactly what that means. Basically, do what needs to be done, but don't hold me accountable. It's on your hands, not mine. How do we know that Pilate was in turmoil in this moment? Well, if we look at history, we actually find out that shortly after this, Pilate went into isolation in the island off of Sicily. And he was approached later by a disciple spreading the gospel of Jesus. And he asked Pilate if he remembered Jesus of Nazareth. And the history stories tell us that he says, I don't remember a thing about him. But that shortly after that disciple left, that Pilate hung himself, understanding the turmoil this man went through as he gave in to the crowd when he did not want Jesus to be crucified. But crucifixion was a Roman penalty for rebellion. And that's what happened here in this trial. But I want you to understand one more thing before we close. That Pilate says in the scriptures handed Jesus over at noon. You see, on this day at noon, it was the hour that the temple began to slaughter the lambs for the Passover. Jesus handed over at noon when the lambs were being slaughtered for the Passover, as Jesus truly is the sacrificial lamb. And that timing was not by accident. I hope you gleaned something as we went through this trial. And next time, we're going to actually cover the crucifixion of Jesus.